people a few more minutes to come in, so don't leave. All right, I'm going to take the closing of the door as a good sign that we should go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today in this very interesting panel about countering violent extremism and human rights online in the debate over content and conduct. I'm Courtney Radge. I'm the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists and have been writing about the press freedom dimensions of the countering violent extremism, which we will be using as the acronym CVE a lot today. So for those of you where this debate is new, CVE stands for Countering Violent Extremism. And I have with me here a very distinguished panel who represent a lot of different perspectives on this topic. We have the private sector represented on the far left by Carl Schoenander, who is the Senior Director of International Public Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association. He's not in your packets because we tried very hard to get somebody from one of the social media or internet platforms, including Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and Microsoft, but nobody was able to come. We are delighted to have Carl here to represent a business perspective. To my left here is Yolanda Rondon, who is coming from a civil society perspective. She is the staff attorney for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC, where she works on legal cases and policy issues related to surveillance, racial and religious profiling, hate crimes in employment, discrimination, and immigration. To my right is J.D. Maddox, who is the Director of Analytics at the Interagency Global Engagement Center, which is housed at the U.S. Department of State. He is also an adjunct professor at George Mason University, and he'll take a few minutes to tell us more about the Global Engagement Center, but as many of you probably know, the State Department has been at the forefront of countering violent extremism measures online, some of the counter-narrative programs, some of the campaigns that you may have heard about, and so we'll be looking forward to hearing from that perspective. And then on the far right, we have Matt Mitchell, who is a security researcher, operational security trainer, and data journalist with Crypto Harlem. His work focuses on marginalized, aggressively monitored, over-policed populations in the United States. And so this panel is designed to talk about what the implications of the countering violent extremism online agenda and efforts are having on human rights and on populations. We probably know most about what's happening in the fight against ISIS, but one thing we wanted to emphasize with this panel is that we can't just focus on ISIS because this has broader repercussions on populations of all different kinds, both in the US and abroad, because of course the internet is global. In your packets, you have a description of the panel and some of the questions that we want to get at, which are looking at the impacts on marginalized and at-risk communities, whether those measures are compatible with human rights standards. One of the questions in the description of the panel is, how can we find a balance between legitimate law enforcement goals and the needs of communities to enjoy human rights online? But we're going to interrogate the very premise of a balance, because a joint statement by the UN Special Rapporteur, as well as the Organization of American States, the OSCE, and the African Union's Court of Human Rights, their special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, all came out and said that balancing is the wrong term because there's already established human rights principles that restrictions on freedom of expression, which is a fundamental human right, must be necessary and proportional. And we're going to talk about the responsibilities of companies and governments in an age of international terrorism. So I first want to go down the panel, and this is going to be a moderated conversation. So I'm going to start with some brief remarks from each of these panelists to tell you about how their work intersects with this debate and how they're thinking about these issues. We're then going to have a conversation. So if you have something that you want to mention or ask a question about, please raise your hand. Now, just because we're up here doesn't mean that there isn't valuable expertise in the audience. So I welcome that, but I will ask you to keep your interventions short, just like you'll hear that I'm asking the people up here to keep their conversation short so we can actually grapple with some of these very challenging issues. We also have a hashtag, which is IGF-USA _rights, and I believe there's a remote moderator here, Great. So if there's somebody online who has a question that's directly relevant to something we are discussing now, please flag me. I really want this to be interactive, and I want us to grapple with some very complex and challenging issues. So with that, I'd like to kick it off by asking JD Maddox to tell us a bit about what is the Global Engagement Center. We heard earlier it is not a dating site. So tell us, what is it?
Wow. That's quite an introduction. So first of all, thanks to IGF for having me. I mean, this is an incredible panel, very, very interesting backgrounds, and I'm really impressed by it. I think we're 4 people who seem to have very different perspectives on this issue, but I think we're all grappling with the same thing, which is the useful application, legal application even, of technologies against some really significant problems. And each of us comes at that in a different way. So, I mean, I think this conversation will be very useful, actually for all of us. I'm representing the Global Engagement Center, which is, again, an interagency office housed at the State Department. And our core goal is to challenge an agile adversary who's aggressively deploying social media and other communications technologies for propaganda purposes, and who has no legal restrictions to its use. On the other hand, the GEC, as I'll call it, strictly obeys U.S. law. So I'm eager to just give a quick overview of how the GEC does its business, and I won't go too deep, and I'm wide open to questions. So the GEC, on paper, is the organization for the U.S. government that is tasked with coordination, integration, and synchronization of government-wide communication activities directed at foreign audiences to counter the messaging and diminish the influence of international terrorist organizations. That's on paper in our executive order. Sorry to read it. But essentially, we're broken into 4 categories of operations. The first is content. The second is partnerships. The third is interagency engagement, and the fourth is data analytics. Content is essentially the development of campaigns. We conduct campaigns internationally, again, against foreign audiences. They're broad-based information campaigns for the most part. We also have an in-house digital outreach team that conducts online counter-messaging against extremists, mostly in social media. Partnerships is developing foreign partners who can conduct operations similar to what the GEC is conducting in their own native voice with their own credibility out to their own audiences. We recognize that the U.S. government is not always the best voice for countering violent extremists. Interagency engagement is essentially developing the network that conducts these operations globally. And then data analytics, I'm the director of analytics. Now, we recognize that broadly the community that's engaged in this is very good at understanding the problem, the landscape. We can pretty much tell you right now, what ISIL and other extremist groups are doing online, what's going viral, what their core narratives are, and who they are. We're trying to use the latest technologies from the private side and from the government side to take it a step further, to understand what are the susceptibilities of the most important audiences out there. Where is ISIL and where are other terrorist organizations trying to get their recruits, and how can we get to those potential recruits first to counter the radicalizing message of terrorist groups? So in a nutshell, that's what we're up to. I'm wide open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we hear is that there is both the efforts to proactively influence the message online. I think the Global Engagement Center, correct me if I'm wrong, and the State Department do identify themselves as such. Yes?
Yes, always.
Okay.
So we're completely overt, and we always stamp our work with our DOS seal.
So, which may or may not be effective. And that you're aiming to counter radicalization by preventing people online from getting access to those messages. We've heard about some of the campaigns. Maybe some of the people in this room have heard about Think Again, Turn Away, which was a social media campaign that the center ran, I think, maybe I don't know if you felt it was successful. I think that there were a lot of groups that felt it lacked some credibility. And I think this issue of credibility and native voice, one of the partners of the State Department is the United Arab Emirates, the Sawaya Center. And I think there were questions that civil society has raised, the Center for Democracy and Technology, us at CPJ, Human Rights Watch, about these partnerships, because these are repressive governments that regularly imprison activists, journalists, and others who express alternative views. So that's one thing we're going to want to return to. But I want to turn now to talk about the domestic context a bit more, because obviously as the State Department, you're focused on the international context. So Yolanda, can we turn to you, and can you talk to us a little bit about how your work intersects with CVE?
Good morning. The American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee was founded in 1980, and we're wholly a civil rights organization dedicated to protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of Arab Americans and communities of color in the United States. Now, since 2011, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee has worked largely both in legislation as well as in advocacy efforts to ensure that our government has restraints and adequate restraints on civil rights and civil liberty protections, meaning that there's an actual oversight, that there's required reporting, that there's required training, that there are non-discrimination clauses. And this is crucial because in decades preceding before 9/11 and before Arab Americans became under a microscope, there was active efforts to censor content and speech for those who were politically oppressed, the silence. We've always gone after communities of color, whether they were African American, whether they were Hispanic, whether they were Japanese, and intended to silence that oppression. And so when we get to the CVE context, this is extremely alarming because we see that future in which political speech that the government does not like or does not agree with being flagged and removed. Our position has always been that the best counter to hate speech or violent speech is more speech. You never take away speech, because let's give an example on Facebook. At least if someone says something hateful, there's a dialogue, there's a back and forth. Someone can question that. They can make that person think about it. If we remove that speech in itself, what it actually does is send that person into the deep web, which are the real issues and threats we're concerned about when we think about ISIS and things of that nature. And now they're on these hate sites where there is no countering view. There is no opposition. And that's what really fuels people. They're getting that little nudge, like, yeah, we should do, because we all agree together to do this. So that's concerning. But also this other aspect, as an attorney and in law school, I was trained in 3 years to study human rights aspects. We come from a due process issue. And when we look at CVE, and especially our government trying to get the internet and company sector on board, we look at it as a government trying to become or make internet and you tech guys extensions of law enforcement, right? Just like we wouldn't want the government in our phones, little military or police, we shouldn't want the government in our computer systems or in our social media accounts or anything of that nature. We have to also make sure that speech is not always a pretext to a specific behavior or conduct. When we look at the fight on ISIS, it's actually about conduct and behavior. We need to make sure that we vigorously, at all aspects, defend the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. One of the biggest cases litigated by the ACLU themselves was defending the right of the Ku Klux Klan to protest and spew hatred. When we look in the context of Trump and all the hate speech he has and incited in this country, no one has censored him. No one has said, oh, don't say that. They have, but they haven't removed them from the media. Why? Because we appreciate that dialogue and we want to debate those issues. And so in the same context, what was the answer to that hate speech? The administration of Obama and others and community civil society coming out and condemning those actions with more speech. And so that's what we address these issues with, because CVE, at least in our experience as ADC, has been used to target the Arab and Muslim community, in which it has impacted our very children who are afraid to even state that they're Arab or state that they have believe in Islam. And this leads to self-censorship where people no longer want to even advocate. If you think about it, extremism is what made our country great. Extremism is protected by the First Amendment. It's the violent actions that may or may not happen that are not protected. But I beg this question and to pose to you, and I encourage your feedback on this. Would we want to live in a country where the civil society organizations and major civil rights organizations like the ACLU are silenced because they politically oppose government actions? And that's exactly what's being translated onto the internet with content censor removals. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think you raised two really critical points, well, many critical points that I want to pull out. One is the lack of definition. So one of the key problems that people across the board and all stakeholder groups recognize is that there's a lack of definition about extremism. Obviously, this has also been a politicized issue, but it's very hard for us to know, when we're talking about countering violent extremism, the vast majority of government policy appears aimed at ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, whatever acronym you want to use. But in reality, and in debate, there's a question, is it just ISIS or is it violent extremism? In America, a lot of that violent extremist actual action is committed by white supremacy groups, but we don't see that so much addressed. There's an outstanding question about, do you expand the definition or do you try to limit it? The other issue you brought up is the fact that, views and expression do not equal violent acts. And the literature on this subject overwhelmingly shows that the majority of people who hold extreme views never commit violent acts. And so, what is happening when we are, as you said, removing viewpoints that don't adhere to the mainstream? So I want to turn now to Matt to talk a bit about his experience and, preface it with revelations a couple of days ago about a new tool that's been developed that is looking at social media, monitoring, police radios, and other things to do predictive analysis of where you're going to see outbreaks of violence around the Black Lives Matters movement and some of the response to the shootings. So we're seeing again that the techniques that are being developed algorithmically and on social media monitoring to address the ISIS threat is being now extended to the domestic context. So Matt, can you tell us a bit about where you're coming from as a data journalist, as an activist in this topic?
Yeah, sure. I work with different groups inside the domestic United States, just different activists and journalists, and training them in digital security and operational security, which is how to use these digital security tools. I think while it's cool to see Black Lives Matter written in the pamphlet here, I'm from Crypto Harlem, and that's one of my projects, which is in the Harlem, which is a community in Manhattan, teaching people how to use simple cryptography tools. To speak more on your question about predictive analytics and how people can try to, and that's something that we see with CVE. There's an attempt to look at sentiment analysis, which is how a sentence or a paragraph is structured. Compare that to some corpus of data and predict, is this user a violent extremist, or has their behavior suddenly changed and they've suddenly moved towards an ideal that appears to be extremist and possibly violent in its nature. And we see similar technologies being used to see hey, if someone tweets a certain message, can we analyze that and see if maybe that they may be mentally ill or having suicidal thoughts, and then can we take an action before the person even realizes who they are or what they're thinking. And I think that right now the technology is flawed, and we cannot apply. One is we cannot properly identify whether someone is about to go from an extreme view to a violent expression of that extreme view. And there's plenty of research and data that shows this. And another thing is what would we do even if we did know that, especially talking about people who develop platforms, software and websites on the internet. Facebook is a company. It's not a country. There's no like constitution that says you have to have the right to sell arms in Facebook groups, or you have to have the right to say things or not say things on Facebook. So I think it's dangerous, to Yolanda's point, this idea of blocking messages that may be violent, because one person's extreme is not another person's extreme. And another person's viewpoint of what might be like a violent is not the same thing as another one. So, when we look at things like the Don't Be a Puppet website, which is part of the CVE program, which has been rolled out by the FBI. And in it, there's a little video, and it's like, hey, I'm Comey, and I'm just talking to you about, how we can keep you, a young person, from being a puppet. It reminds me of the early Say No to Drugs messaging, and I hope that it has like a little more effectiveness. But in seeing how it's rolled out, it looks a lot like a quiz, like those listicles that you'll see on BuzzFeed. And you just go through and you answer these questions, and they're saying like, hey, which one of your friends might be a violent extremist here? Look at this demo of a Facebook wall. Maybe this environmental activist is going to go violent. And you're like, yes. And they're like, good, Jane. Maybe, my friend is going on vacation without his parents. Maybe he's going to turn into a violent extremist. It's like, very good, John. And I feel like, this is not, technology is wonderful. An analog I like to say is like, look, at one point fire was technology. At one point the wheel was technology. We should use technology in policing. We should use technology in our kitchens, right? But we need to understand what is capable and what reality is and what the problem that we really face is. And currently CVE focuses on not just this idea of a violent extremist as someone who's an American or someone who uses Western internet services, and then they're going to go bear arms and fight in some foreign war. But also under CVE is this definition of environmentalist as violent extremist, and animal rights activist as violent extremist, and people from Movement from Black Lives could be seen as violent extremists to someone, right? Just being loud could be seen as violent, If everyone's sitting down and someone takes a call on their phone, that could be violent, right? So I feel that as someone who's a technologist and a developer who writes code, we have to be really careful in understanding what these things do and what they don't. And blocking is not a good solution. We're not a country of censorship and blocking and hiding ideas. If anything, we're at our best when we have diversity of thought, different arguments and ideas are expressed. That's what being American is about. So I feel like when it comes to the internet and CVE, a lot of it right now is, like there was a Reuters report, I think it was like June 25th, right? Joseph Wen, Dustin Volts, exclusive. Google, and I think they found it also on Facebook, seem to be using hashes to automatically remove videos. So, normally what will happen is there's some kind of like recommendation engine. People vote this is abusive or it's not, and every company has their own viewpoint on what they should do when something gets enough votes to move over a certain meter. In this, it's no longer up to public debate. A computer has automatically said, this is a bad video, right? It has a signature of that video in its system, and if that shows up anywhere, it's automatically removed. And, that could be a political video. It could be a campaign video. It could be, it really depends. Like when you're talking about things about the government trying to stop violent extremism, the government is fluid. The government today is not the government of tomorrow. That's the beauty of this country, right? We don't have a dictatorship that someone stays in power for 50 years. But it's also dangerous when certain things that shouldn't be rolled out are rolled out. And I'll just kind of hope I spoke to your point. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much. I think you raised several good points, and you mentioned hashing, which is this idea. I had to look into it because it's something new that was just revealed, I think, in the popular press that was happening around the extremism issues through the Counter-Extremism Project. And apparently the computer scientist who invented the same hashing technique for child pornography, which is now being used by several companies as a way to automatically identify child pornography. But there have been several discussions about the fact that extremist material is different from child pornography, and that child pornography has a victim inherent in that content, whereas extremist content does not, and that it's much, much more difficult to define, as you just mentioned, what is extremist versus, say, what is child pornography. So that's one issue. But you bring up this idea of the role, of private companies not being a country. Yet we see the fact that Facebook has many more active daily users than many countries in the world. And between Facebook and Google, you could say that they comprise the public sphere of today's world. In many cases, it is one of the only places where people in repressive societies, for example, can express themselves or report. And you focused very much on the domestic context, but I'd also like to note that, of course, as we know working online, nothing that happens on the internet can be confined domestically. And of course, what the US does in internet policy has broad repercussions. And we're seeing this around the world, with countering violent extremism being used as an excuse in India and China to restrict reporting and access to certain areas where Maoists have been designated as terrorist groups, and therefore you're not able to report on them. In Turkey, reporters who have attempted to cover PKK areas or areas in the south, which is where a lot of the fight with ISIS is happening, have been arrested on terrorism charges, arrested for using encryption. So what we're seeing is that this CVE agenda is being extended to around the world to clamp down on legitimate reporting, on legitimate criticism, and on political opposition. But I want to now turn to the company perspective, and specifically around this idea of companies making decisions about who gets to speak, who gets their content to stay online and who doesn't, who has the power to remove content. You mentioned this idea of, there's a popular discussion somehow involved in whether a piece of content is flagged from removal. But what we're seeing is that private companies are acquiescing to public and governmental pressure to do something about ISIS online. And so there are several projects that have been developed around algorithms. There's a physicist who's created a math equation that can lead to a predictive formula, he argues. There's something called a Beware algorithm, which is being used by a police department in Fresno, California. There are uses of AI, of artificial intelligence, and monitoring of digital conversations and sentiment analysis, as you mentioned. And then there are also these internet referral units in governments which are referring sites to the private companies under the excuse that those sites or those comments or pictures are a violation of the private company's terms of service, but those are being done outside of a legal process. We know that, for example, YouTube has given super flagger status to the UK government, which allows it to take vast swaths of material offline automatically. So we'd like to know, from the company perspective, where does this responsibility to respond to political and public pressure, to create the communities that they want to have, while perhaps being cognizant of the idea that many of these public spaces where these images are appearing and where these conversations are taking place are very important spheres for public debate. Can you talk a bit about the role of companies in this issue? Carl.
Sure. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. So my name's Carl Schoenender. I work for the Software and Information Industry Association. We have about 700 members. Many of the social media companies that you're all aware of are members of SIA. We also have companies that produce content, publishers, etc. So, as companies, we have responsibilities, and in the U.S. context, obviously, U.S. law is, one of the most important lenses through which we see this this issue of countering violent extremism. So you probably know that there's something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a very important piece of legislation. It's commonly sort of interpreted as a means for as the vehicle through which companies such as social media companies are not liable for what is said over their networks, and that's true. But what is also part of that legislation, sometimes called the Good Samaritan concept here, is that companies, in exchange for that absence of liability, are supposed to assume certain responsibilities, undefined, but nonetheless responsibilities. So what might those responsibilities be? They could be takedowns of material. They could have, but also a sort of countervailing responsibility to foster free speech and association, and an affirmative responsibility to take steps to counter violent extremism. But again, those are sort of responsibilities. They're not legal obligations. The way companies deal with this is companies have, and the larger they are, the more developed they are, they have policies, and they're different. But for example, one company that's been mentioned here is Facebook. So Facebook has a zero tolerance policy for ISIL accounts. Another company that everybody's familiar with is Twitter, and I think there was a Brookings Institution study several years ago which mentioned that they had closed down several thousand accounts associated with extremist groups. So you know, what we try as companies to look at this pragmatically. You know, obviously, if you another sort of legal approach to deal with this is, well, if there's offending content, then get a court order to take it down or do something about it. That's one approach. You know, given the scale of the problem, I think a lot of people think that there needs to be a combination of approaches. So a pragmatic approach, maybe evidence-based policy making. We're industry, so we support voluntary approaches, obviously. I mean, I just say that this is an incredibly difficult area to work in. I think we've all seen that. Beyond just saying you need to have a conversation about this, I think we need to have really good data and really good sort of, you know, annual production of data to figure out where we go. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. You bring up obviously several issues as well that are key to and central to this debate is, you know, voluntary measures, whether there should be, you know, the use of legal mechanisms or not, and of course data. And I think that what we've seen is a lot of new interest in this topic, and so hopefully we'll get more data. But what you see from doing, you know, literature review of the field is that there is very little evidence that ties exposure to, you know, ISIS propaganda or extremist propaganda to actual violent acts. There are anecdotes, but very little data. One data scientist pointed out, and it's been reported in the press as well, that if you look at the percentage of people who are being recruited to go to Syria or Libya or Iraq to fight, it's such a small percentage, so I think it's around 300 in the US, that to actually target those online is incredibly difficult, and that if you even have, you know, a 1% error rate, you've essentially negated that entire effort. So, you know, it's a lot of money and effort being spent to target, you know, population.
I just wanted to chime in at this to give the exact number. We had a meeting with ODNI Director Clapper a week or two ago, and the number given to us was 250 since 2012 when they started counting. And this is not only including those who have actually traveled, but those who have attempted, been inspired to, or actually traveled. So that's 3 categories. The inspired to category is the number. And so when we look at it, there's approximately almost 321 million people in the United States. So that's 250 out of 321 million. That is 0.00078 1/100th less than 1%. That's what we're focused on. Meanwhile, last year, the homicide rate in the United States of violent cases that went unresolved was at 50%. So where do we really need the resources at? And that has been our issue with countering violent extremism. It's been focused on trying to police thoughts, ideas, and beliefs. It needs to focus on violent conduct and acts. And so law enforcement needs to focus on solving actual crimes.
Very good point. And then if you think about the population of Facebook, it's over 1 billion. So if we look at the number of foreign recruits, you know, being in several thousands worldwide, again, the challenge becomes apparent. But I wanted to ask JD about how, because obviously the State Department is not focused on the domestic audience, they're focused on an international audience. And how are you seeing the countering violent extremism efforts of your office and the U.S. government being interpreted by the U.S. partners overseas? Can you talk a bit more about how you're approaching that?
Sure, thanks. So, but by the way, I should mention that we did a study a few weeks ago. By the end of June of this year, over a 2-year period, and these stats came out in the New York Times last week, there has been a 45% decline of pro-ISIL tweets. And so the statistics are showing us that we are certainly contributing to a decrease in that volume, but we fully admit that there's, you know, still a strong audience out there for ISIL or Daesh's propaganda, and so we have to consistently focus on that consistent audience. But I think that the effort, the partnership effort, is certainly a growth industry. You know, you mentioned the UAE's Sawab Center, and currently they are conducting social media counter-propaganda against, mostly focused on ISIL or Daesh. And we're looking to East Asia, North Africa, and Europe partners to develop similar organizations with the intent of, you know, initially doing that social media outreach, but then getting into some of the same lines of business that the GEC is in, including, you know, strong information dissemination campaigns and other activities.
So what is the difference between what these partner governments are doing with the U.S. government and what the Iran 50 center parties do, or sorry, the Iranian, you know, Basiji army does online, or what the Chinese 50 centers do, which is basically the idea that they have these paid commenters to go out and, you know, counteract. I think Israel also has, you know, gotten volunteers to go out and counteract messages from Hamas, for example. So should we see this in the same vein, or should we see this as something different?
The efforts coming out of the UAE, for example, are part of the broader counter-ISIL coalition efforts. So, you know, there's a huge contingent of countries who are engaged in the, you know, the kinetic fight against ISIL on the ground, and they're also contributing to this effort against ISIL's propaganda online and in the virtual space. So, as you know, as you see UAE putting out their counter-propaganda and the GEC putting out its counter-propaganda and our other partners, typically that is you know, is intended to be a centralized effort. So we are coordinating with each other, making sure that our counter-messaging is synchronized and that we're focusing on the same problems and same vulnerabilities of ISIL.
So, around these issues that we were talking about with the private sector, you know, one of the things that has stood out in my work is the extreme risks that journalists take to bring information. So specifically in Syria, Raqqa is the self-declared, you know, capital of the self-declared Islamic State. And one of the only alternative information sources on the ground is a citizen journalist group called Raqqa is being slaughtered silently. And their members have been murdered. The family members of members have been murdered. Some of them moved to Turkey in order to escape. They were assassinated in Turkey, and now some of them are living in Germany, but they're still trying to bring information on the ground. So we know how challenging it is to get information out. But their accounts were taken down by Facebook and by Twitter, mainly by Facebook, and so they were stymied in their efforts. And we've heard, this is just one example of many. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a French journalist whose account was blocked because he had, in a report that he wrote, he had a picture of an ISIS flag to illustrate. So one of the things that we're seeing is the challenges of coming up with an approach that doesn't close down these accounts and content that is very important to providing an alternative narrative from citizens on the ground versus, say, the government. How are private companies trying to grapple with that?
Yeah, and I can't really speak to the details of the Facebook case that you mentioned, but obviously very interesting. I think they're struggling with this issue. I think this is really the correct answer, and I think companies have mechanisms whereby people who feel that they've been unjustly shut down can complain. How effective they are, that's open to question, obviously. But there are policies, and that's how they should deal with this issue. Yeah.
So I just do want to remind everyone that if you are interested in contributing, do raise your hand. But I'm going to go back to this idea of, you mentioned kinetic action on the ground, which sounds a bit like a euphemism for the war going on, or violent conflict. So one of the things that, I'm also, outside of my CPJ role, I'm writing a report for the Center for International Media Assistance about the impact of countering violent extremism on media development. So as part of that, I've reviewed 300 sources and conducted 40 interviews, and overwhelmingly agree, there's overwhelming agreement that there's, and you kind of mentioned this, the lack of credibility of governmental voices. And that's one of the reasons you mentioned that there's these partnerships. I think that's another reason that we see private companies are funding civil society groups to help them learn how to use these tools better. But I think there's also a recognition that many of the extremists who have been radicalized have legitimate grievances. And this takes us back again to the domestic context, where there are these legitimate grievances, political movements, efforts to change the status quo that are then getting, flagged as extremist content. So, where do we go from here? Where should we be thinking of in terms of, is there a technological solution for this? I want to turn to Matt and Yolanda specifically on the, from the civil rights perspective. Should we even be considering technological solutions to this issue?
Okay, I'll speak first. CVE, or countering violent extremism, or in the UK, it's preventing violent extremism. The world is a wonderful world. The world is a peaceful world. The world is a violent world. The world's got a lot of different elements to it. Do we need government to try to make the world more unicorn, rainbows, ice cream? Is that a good expenditure of funds? I don't think so, right? I already, spoke about how I don't believe that blocking works. You only can use technology to solve, these, CVE and violence is not a technological problem. So when asking the world's best engineers to solve it, they're going to say, it's going to be hard to come up with a technological solution because, people have extreme views and people have moderate views and people have different views on the different spectrums, and how much can we control there? To your point earlier about Raqqa, the big pushback with Apple against the FBI with decrypting this phone in San Bernardino was that, look, we can do this. We can create this back door, but the back door will be open for hacktivists and hackers and other nation states, Russia, China, etc. Right now, social media companies and people who make encryption tools and circumvention tech are under huge amounts of pressure from the United States government to, what are you doing about this violent extremism problem? You know, you're not doing enough. Too many groups, too many chatter, too many people, too many members of your product seem to be violent extremists. And I don't know whether like they should be really doing anything, because what happens when there's another constituent, maybe China, that has putting a lot of pressure on Facebook or YouTube to create signatures of certain types of videos and pull those down, you know? You can say like a factory farm video looks violent to some people. What happens when the meat industry is like, hey, we're putting pressure on, you know, Twitter to take those down? Like, we have a right in this country to express our views, to assemble, whether that's virtual or in person. And I kind of feel like that's.
So is this, how is this impacting on that? Is it?
Well, I think it's quieting a voice, because it has like a chilling effect. When you see that your messaging isn't being used, I mean, at the end of the day, it depends what the metric of success is for countering violent extremism in these platforms. Like, you can't say like, you know, respectfully, like our tweets are down, or, you know, membership is down. Maybe they just went to another website or another platform, because the internet is boundless. It has no end. You can try to bomb someone off the planet, but you can't bomb someone off the internet, because there's no end to the internet. So what happens is people just tend to move into different corners, and it kind of brings us to a place where we become less democratic. And I think it's a really dangerous version of the internet. You know, the internet that I love is an internet where you could be anonymous, and, you know, no one knows that you're a dog on the internet, and you can say whatever you want on the internet, and you can be a troll, or you could be someone who changes someone's political viewpoint, or, you know, galvanizes like positive change in this world.
I just wanted to add a few points. Currently in the law, in order for any site to be taken down, content to be taken down, the government has to meet a probable cause standard, has to go before a judge, whether we like the process or not, and get a warrant to do so. And it's a very difficult and high burden, because you have to show imminent threat and harm. And that's why so many hate sites exist. So why, in this realm, we feel that we can pre-deter or pre-crime or try to go around the court system and avoid due process and the 14th Amendment, the 4th Amendment, and the First Amendment. So that's concerning to me. The second point I want to make is that even if I don't agree that the technology sector and the internet should be involved in combating violent acts or terrorism, but even if they were, is it truly going to be effective? My answer is no. Because we're not addressing, quote unquote, the root causes of violent acts or terrorism. The root causes of violent acts of terrorism has been lack of respect for human rights. You getting involved in CVE is initiating more, disregard to human rights principles. Second, systematic abuse by law enforcement or governments. And 3, a lack of opportunity. So instead of addressing those root issues and putting resources into those areas, like investing in schools, enforcing hate crime reporting, holding police accountable, we are creating a problem and then saying, here's the money to solve it. So we're going around in a circle. Second, as was mentioned briefly, is that there is no research, empirical evidence-based research or assessments done that shows that CVE is even needed or exists. It's not based on science. Are you going to evaluate your success based on number of shares, number of likes, number of who told you, oh, you see that website yesterday, you put it on Twitter and LinkedIn, and it can't work, it can't be assessed. So to me, it just is a feel-good measure. We want to say we're doing something. We want to make society feel we've created a safe place. It's just not going to work. And the last thing I want to touch upon, and I think the UN Special Rapporteur Ben Emerson said it best in his report. He made 2 points regarding censorship online. Measures taken to prevent or remove messages communicated through the internet or other forms of technology constitute an interference with the right to freedom of expression. Bans on the operation of certain sites should not be generic, but if done, content specific. No site or information dissemination system should be prohibited from publishing material solely on the basis that it may be critical of the government or the social system espoused by the government. And so currently, the way I believe, in my interpretation, the way some of these tech groups, including Facebook, have been removing content is based upon title alone, or perhaps use of discriminatory or racial algorithms, in which they're not truly reviewing the heart of the content. Just because a title of an item is maybe not pleasing, doesn't mean the actual content itself, or even the name of the website, espouses that idea. And that's where we go into, if our government doesn't even know where to draw the line on a gray area of what's First Amendment protected speech and what's not, how are we going to give that power and authority to tech groups to draw that gray area line? There will be never any sufficient review process in a tech group, no matter how many grievance processes, complaint forms, if they have lawyers there, it's just not going to be sufficient. That's why you go before a court, either whether it's before a judge or things of that nature, to get those things done. And I just want to round out with the fact that the founders of our country were extremists. They were. That's how we got the Bill of Rights, Martin Luther King was deemed an extremist. W.E.B. Du Bois was deemed an extremist. Plenty of our leaders have been. And this has changed America today to something great. And so we just have to ensure that technology is being used to actually spread more good speech. And that's always been the counter and solution to hate speech.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing in Emerson's points. I think the UN has played an important role in this debate in some aspects, and probably many of you know that the UN Secretary General has a plan of action on countering violent extremism. And going to this issue of drivers of extremism, there are a plethora in there. There are so many that, range from poverty to people with too much education and not enough economic opportunity. So, the whole range of things. I think it's very clear that there are multiple drivers of extremism, and therefore thinking about how to target makes it very challenging. But this idea that the policies of the US government and the policies of governments around the world compel some legitimate expressions of discontent. If you look at, say, extremism in Yemen, what we might consider extremism in Yemen, is that not legitimate if they're, being killed by airstrikes, or in Pakistan where drones are coming from, above and killing people? So again, that these kinetic actions on the ground lead to legitimate grievances, as you're saying, grievances then lead to potentially extremist views on how to challenge those. But this idea of what role the private companies should play, I want to ask Carl, how can companies grapple with this tension between, addressing these issues, responding to both public and political pressure, but without giving in to kind of abdicating the role that they have to respect legal mechanisms, both in the US, but also, the international standards that are being developed through, the UN, through these statements by special rapporteurs, et cetera. How do you think that companies looking forward should seek to grapple with this and try to reconcile this idea of using, legitimate legal means versus, say, terms of service or ways to bypass what everyone here, I think, agrees are burdensome processes? And should private companies seek to bypass those processes?
I would put out two things. One is the private sector should do what it's doing now through me, and essentially, which is engage with civil society, the government, et cetera, continue to do that. And companies should be transparent about what they do. Terms of service are not easy to read, usually. I think everybody can do a better job in terms of being clear and in terms of what they do, and to have, good mechanisms for, complaint processes, et cetera, if they arise. All at the same time recognizing that, perfection is not going to be achieved. It's just not. And also recognizing that the law is different in different countries. I described briefly the law that internet companies and others operate by here in the United States. Section 230, quite important in this context. A very robust freedom, First Amendment, freedom of expression requirement, part of U.S. law. Somebody mentioned Ku Klux Klan. The classic example is that, you can express Nazi views in the United States, but you can't express Nazi views in Germany. So, we might have a personal opinion as to whether that's good or bad, but obviously companies have to, follow the law in the countries in which they operate. But just to, as I said, to recapitulate, engagement and transparency, I think, are the primary means. Thanks.
Thank you. And obviously, you alluded to one of the key issues in this, which is sovereignty and where that lies. We have a question. David, can you introduce yourself and speak loudly? I don't know if there's a mic.
And I'm having a tough time, actually. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting set of presentations. You're covering so much territory and so many different issues. I'm having a hard time sort of wrapping my head around whether your concerns are kind of off in the future about possible kind of slippery slope type of situation. We're going to lose our freedoms and we're going to have a big brother sort of government kind of thing, or whether your concerns are more about what's happening today. From where I said, it's actually hard to imagine a more open and accessible internet than what we have here in the United States. As this fellow just mentioned, in Germany, you can't say some things that you can certainly say here. So I guess I'd be interested in hearing from the panelists of very sort of specific examples of today's problems that you see stemming from CVE type of activities.
Thank you, David. So it sounds like those questions would be best addressed by Yolanda and Matt. Obviously, if the other panelists want to intervene, that would be great. But why don't we start with you? Can you talk about some specific issues right now, or are we more concerned about the future?
Sure. I think that in today's world, like, the internet is not a utility, it's almost like a right, as an American who likes to use technology, right? But there are a couple things. Like, on a very, even lower than CVE, more basic level, in inner cities, there are people who their social media accounts are monitored constantly just because they're young and they live in inner city neighborhoods. And there are cases of people who, because of a tweet or a like or a YouTube post, get called into like a gang conspiracy charge, and then they end up serving time in jail, waiting for their day in court. That doesn't come. You could be in a prison for 19 months waiting. This actually happened to someone in my neighborhood, Jelani Henry, and you would think, like, hey, this is the United States and you should be able to post whatever you want. And Twitter says express yourself, and YouTube says show yourself, and Snapchat's like this is a place where you can be yourself. But I think that there are a lot of groups where marginalized communities inside the United States where being yourself is dangerous and you get into trouble. There are cases where activists have their accounts shut down or their entire groups erased. There was an issue with a group that was like a Movement for Black Lives group, and they had a lot of trolls who were just like, oh, okay, this is hate speech or we disagree with this viewpoint, and they lost their group. So, and I find a lot of the activists I train, they're like, how do I keep my group from being taken down or my hashtag from being taken over or things like that. So I'm not talking about maybe like, you know, Big Brother coming, something happening in the future. I'm talking about yesterday, last week, issues that maybe only happen to a small group or someone who has a niche political idea today, but, you know, without any kind of rules or regulations around this, it can happen to, you know, everyone tomorrow. Yeah, actually, there was a really good piece written on it on The Verge, which is more of like a tech website, but they happen to kind of like do some journalistic pieces. His name is Jelani Henry, and the piece, I don't know the headline exactly, but it's something like, does NYPD, you know, cause like youth of Harlem to go to jail based on their social media or something like that?
Why don't we share that on the Twitter, the IGF-USA _rights after the session. We'll share some of this material. Yolanda, do you want to say anything to this?
We're talking about both. So a hard concrete example is now before Congress, they're trying to debate introducing this legislation called the Visa Integrity Act. And this Integrity Act will force all those who enter the United States to hand over, whether they're coming here or on a non-immigrant or immigrant visa, their social media account access in real time. If not, they will not be allowed to come into the United States. Other examples include the release of the Don't Be a Puppet program, in which the program specifically instructs teachers to monitor their students' media accounts and report this, and report not only instances where there's actual violent actions, but it includes expressions of government mistrust, government corruption, political opposition. Yeah. So these are real life examples. Another is, and I'm forgetting his name now, he's a well-known environmental activist. Oh my God, I'm forgetting his name.
We'll share it on the Twitter.
Yeah. He was targeted along with PETA, along with ADC back in post 9/11 for 5 years. Our information, social media accounts, emails, everything was monitored by NSA and FBI on virtue of the civil rights work we did alone. This has happened.
There's also, not to take it away from you, Yolanda, you know, the next generation intelligence biometrics database by the FBI, which is being kind of like rolled out, and there's like a lot of people arguing, like, you know, policymakers about it. But basically what it says not only is, you know, there's going to be a biometrics database that's used if there's a you know, like a federal case and they need to say like, okay, who was this suspect? The faces that it's going to be comparing, those hashes, those signatures that it's going to be comparing are not just people who are like known offenders or people who had some exposure to law enforcement or contact with law enforcement. It's people who have driver's license from certain states. I think it's like up to 18 states have voluntarily submitted everyone's faces into this database. And also the FBI is asking to like have special privacy protection. So how this technology, how the code and how these algorithms work will not be exposed. You couldn't like FOIA request them.
And for my part as well, I would say it's definitely about current practice. I'm happy to share the appendix to the testimony I'm giving on this issue and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, where we went through the CPJ database and pulled 2 years worth of what amounts to about 6 pages of actual cases where journalists have been accused of terrorism or extremism or supporting extremism because of their journalistic activities. But we're also concerned about the future. I think you just alluded to that. Where are we going? This has to do with big data, right? That's part of it, with monitoring and surveillance. What is your ability to express yourself and to enjoy your rights to freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression online in a surveilled, monitored environment? Are there any other questions? Back here.
Hi, I'm Luzovic. I'm from the Netherlands, so I'm trying to get a little bit of a perspective between the US and Europe. And my key question is really, do we know if your approach works? In America, as Carl said, you have a much further freedom of speech than we have in Europe. We have limitations, usually hate speech and calls to violence. We think they work. It's not just the Nazi Party, but other things would be banned as well. We also have very different views on privacy. I mean, in Europe, we get the impression that you Americans are happy to give all your data, you know, especially if somebody's making money off it. Maybe not so much to the government, but hey, you think it can prevent, you know, crime, you're happy to do that too. In Europe, we're much more restrictive, so we'll see where that goes. Do any of you have any idea whether these different approaches have different effects? Is there less violent extremism online or in practice in the US than in Europe? How does that work globally? I just want to know if there's any comparative data yet and how one would measure that. And then I think this, I guess, to JD, you know, you might be the one who should be researching that, what actually works. And my second thing is that this is again from a Dutch perspective. So I'm wondering to what extent you work together with I don't know, civil society groups, but I'll give you an example. What we did in the Netherlands when Geert Wilders, who was our extremist Islamophobic politician, came out with an anti-Quran movie, we expected a huge backlash, violent backlash, along the lines of Denmark. So economic sanctions, attacks, trying to assassinate people, etc. What our counterterrorism guys did was work together with young people online so that they would be the ones saying, hey, don't pay attention to this guy, he's a nutcase, you know, don't go doing exactly the violent stuff he says we're capable of doing. So it was people from the Dutch Muslim immigrant community, mostly Turkish and Moroccan descent, and it was extremely effective because what happened globally after the Dutch movie came out, which was, I think, just as insulting, if not more, than the Danish cartoons, was a lot less than what happened with Denmark. So I'm just wondering to what extent that kind of stuff is happening in practice, and does it work? So basically, are you guys around the table all working together on things like this?
Based on what you're
Hard to
saying.
know where to start, but
that again?
on the issue of
Okay.
you know partnering with
Okay. Yeah.
locals or with in the case
Okay,
of
so I'm just coming out of an investigative journalism fellowship
Sorry,
where
must be a-
we were
must
kind
be
of
a feed.
immersed in this doctrine of follow the money. And I'm wondering how much does profit and
just
revenue
try to speak over
play
me.
into your decisions in
All right,
these
I'll try to be- I'll
programs,
try to be loud.
and how that can affect the outcome for better or for worse.
Did somebody push a button, unfortunately? Okay, we're good. That's right. Okay, so on the issue of you gave the example of working with local kids to undermine the effects of what you considered to be an extreme view. In the same sense, yes, we are working with local audiences, teaming with NGOs, teaming with local governments, teaming with prominent voices overseas to get them to speak with their credibility against, our focus is on violent extremism, Al-Qaeda, ISIL or Daesh, other terrorist groups. So our networking effort within the GEC is focused intently on doing just that. And again, referring to the UAE's Sawab Center, they're engaged in that sort of thing directly. On the issue of, I'm not quite sure how to unpack the question that you're asking about, U.S. versus European. Was it about effectiveness or was it about, from the GEC's perspective, we don't focus on the U.S. audience at all. We have no interest in the domestic audience. We read the literature the same way any other interested party does, but we're not focused on what's going on domestically. But as Yolanda said, the numbers of recruits coming out of the U.S. Joining ISIL, for example, are low, and the numbers coming out of Europe are higher, and per capita much higher, and then in North Africa and Middle East, of course, much higher. But that's not there's no correlation to effective programs. You can't say that we have decreased the number of recruits coming out of the USA just by citing that number. So I'm sorry, but I'd have to kind of dig into your question a little bit more.
Yolanda, I think you might want to talk about the partnership with local communities and.
In our experience, and in our position, especially in the United States, we feel that, ISIS can't reach through a computer screen and recruit. Most recruits who have gone abroad or actually attempted to go abroad have had one-on-one interactions with ISIS, person or ISIS inspired recruit. And so it's less to us, in our opinion, of an internet. The media to us, it has been portrayed as if ISIS is this grand power, but it's actually the one-on-one interaction that actually gets people to go abroad overseas and fight. And so to us, it has, because of all this media rampage, it has essentially created a cottage industry, right? Where there's a whole economy behind these CV programs, okay? DHS just gave out another 10 million. DOJ has their 10 million. FEMA has another 10 million. There are more requests for 100 million, 75 million from the Office of Justice Programs, and it keeps going on. And so with this, the FBI has initiated this Shared Responsibility Committee program to pre-crime and stop people from becoming violent extremists. But what's concerning to us is that in this regard, in our country,
Thank you, Lee, and thank you to all the
and what has happened in
panelists.
Minnesota
My name is
is
Tim
that
Galvin. I'm with Affiliates.
our government has
Since we're
used
talking
community
about technology
engagement and
solutions,
outreach
I wanted to
as a
ask about
guise
the
to conduct
future of
surveillance
those
and
solutions,
intelligence
and,
in the
you know,
Arab
their
and Muslim
long-term
communities.
maintenance and existence.
The only reason why we
Now,
found
you've
out
already
about
partly
this because
answered
of
my question
FOIAs
because you talked
and
about
leaks
Comcast's
to
long-term
the
commitment
Intercept and other
to the
news
project
media
that it's
outlets.
doing.
For
And
example,
I'm hopeful
back in
that,
2009,
Olga, since,
2008,
you
the
know, I mean,
FBI, along with the local
disability
law
policies have been
enforcement,
around for such a long
specifically
time. There's been
hired
some
fake
deployed,
teachers to
you know,
go into
technologies,
the
and
Somali
as we've
Muslim
all
schools
recognized along the way
and
here,
watch them
the internet
under the guise
and
of an
internet
after-school
technologies
program,
evolved
got all
at
their
such a
media
fast
accounts,
pace.
information, etc.,
And we're all thinking
created a
about the present.
database,
We're all looking
and
at
reported
the
it back
best
to the
solution
FBI.
for the here and
So
now
we have
that
a
I can achieve in
hesitancy
order
as our
to
community to work
increase
with the
access,
government, because
and
even
then
with these new
another
shared
level of
responsibility
access,
committees that have been
affordable
developed,
access
it's
and
explicitly
access
in
for
the
people
letters of
with, special
engagement
needs and
that the
disabilities.
information collected,
But
even if it falls
what about
under
issues
HIPAA laws,
of obsolescence
client
or,
privilege
you know,
information,
technologies that
clergy
become
member
orphaned?
privilege information,
I mean,
or even
what happens down the
psychiatrist
road?
privilege information
You know,
is
what's
supposed to be
next after
shared
your
with the
project has
FBI,
come and gone,
and the
and
FBI
you've got
can
these
share
things
it with
deployed out
foreign
there?
government agencies.
What happens to these
And
people
these
down the
people
road?
have not been convicted of a
And
crime.
what happens when the
And
technologies
so
have
in
evolved and
our
they've
instance,
changed,
in
and
our
now what they have
case,
no longer works?
there is no
Or,
separation
you know,
between
in fact, is
community
just not,
engagement
doesn't
and
work with
surveillance and
current technologies, or is left
counterterrorism
behind
work.
because the companies have come and gone.
And they
I mean,
should
up
never
here
be mixed.
we have very large
And
companies
so with
between
us in the
Microsoft
United
and
States,
Dish and
it's
Comcast
increasingly
who would probably like
alarming
to think
that we
they're not
have
really
no
going to go anywhere in
privacy.
the long term.
There is no privacy
But,
rights. They want to
you know, you are
avoid going
dependent
around due
on other
process of the
technology
courts.
providers for some of the projects that you're pushing
And just
forward.
to, I've left
You
at
know,
the
what
point
happens
earlier,
when
the
they
guy's
change?
name who
And,
was
you know, you
environmentalist
can no
who's
longer
been
use what you've
also
currently
felt
been
this was
using all
Will
along.
Potter.
Thank you.
That's his name, who has his media accounts and social stuff have been redacted and retained and monitored by the government.
So, Carl, you want to weigh in on the Europe question?
So thank you. Maybe we can put this on the information that we're going to distribute later, but about 3 weeks ago, I think, the European Commission announced together with a number of companies a voluntary agreement to deal with violent extremism online. It was interesting. A number of U.S. firms participate in that as well, so I just throw that out there as a piece of information. And one more thing on the issue of privacy. I just had to note U.S. sectoral privacy system and the high level of enforcement actions in the United States as well. That's not to say one system is better than the other, simply to say that there is a system in the United States. Thanks.
Just to speak about, you know, this idea of two different views of how to approach this similar issue. There's a group, well, in the UK, they have Preventing Violent Extremism, and they have this system called Prevent, which is rolled out. And there were some major problems with Prevent. For example, there was a young man who was accused of being a violent extremist because he went to, I think, like a college group after, you know, his lessons, and, you know, all of a sudden he got dragged into the police. There was a 9-year-old who wrote a search term, and it was keyworded. They were asking questions about their parents and things like that. And there are a lot of activists who I work with or know of inside the UK. there's a group called UK Cage, who do a lot of work in the Muslim community, who are like getting people who are already kind of gone extreme, kind of talk them down and bring them back into, not being violent, right? You can have an extreme political view without being violent. There's Majid Nawaz, who I met in Oslo and at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and he's someone who used to be an extremist, and now he's a counter-extremist, and has like a, and he's also British, and he speaks about his experiences, and a lot of the issues have to do with, sometimes by having saying an idea as a weapon or an idea as dangerous, kind of plays into the hand of, that's why they squash your idea. That's why they don't let you speak on this issue. I work with a lot of Antifa activists in Germany, and a lot of things that they'll tell you when they're recruiting you to be a neo-Nazi is, that's why you can't read Mein Kampf, and that's why we can't display these images. It plays into this idea that we're this like victim, we're this oppressed group, and I think that is kind of dangerous. And Germany has an organization called Exit Deutschland, which is kind of like, hey, there's a way out, because you kind of get isolated by not having a way to express yourself, and then you cut ties with everyone who doesn't have an extreme view, and then you're caught in a vacuum. So I feel like there may be some even caution with this idea of blocking, words and censoring things. And then also in Oslo, I met Bjorn Alner, who he was a victim of a terrorist attack in Norway. He was on this island where right-wing extremists, fired weapons and, slaughtered children. And now he works his whole life passionately to counter violent extremism. And he has some technological, ideas about countermeasuring, and how maybe that when there's a message that says one thing, we can have a positive message that says another thing. And he works in Norway and in Turkey, expressing those ideas. So, those are just, my personal interactions with different groups who are European, and their thoughts on things that worked, maybe things that didn't work.
Well, I want to thank you for that question. The Code of Ethics, which Carl was referring to, did indeed come out a few weeks ago. I think from civil society's perspective, there was not sufficient consultation on that, and we're deeply concerned about a 24-hour turnaround. There's just no way you can do a due process in that time. But there are this issue of countering violent extremism touches on several internet governance issues, on freedom of expression online, freedom of association online, privacy. It's a multifaceted issue. It should be in conversation with things like child pornography, like big data, and so we're delighted that this was able to get a session at the IGF-USA. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I want to thank our panelists. I think they did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
I know it's a
My
broad
name is Sharida.
issue, but please join me in giving them a hand and thanking them.
The University of Pennsylvania Center for Technology, Innovation and Competition. My question is in relation to data that you're collecting on the impact of your initiatives. I wanted to know whether or not you only look at direct impact, i.e. the number of homes that are connected or number of individual subscriptions, or do you also, as in the case of Comcast, if you have community centers, do you see indirect outreach of your initiatives that are connecting these unconnected communities? Because it seemed like an important